Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. We got to talk a little bit about Seattle and Portland and the madness that's going on there. We got to get Chris Rufo back on the show. He's been crushing it lately. He's been exposing a couple things. First, the DIE training, the diversity, inclusion, equity training and brainwashing that's going on in different governments, city, state, even federal government. So he's been exposing a lot of that training that's been going on. And people in Seattle have been leaking documents to him about how and why they're cutting police funding by 50% and cutting the county jail population by 60%. Now, I got to ask him this. I'm not quite sure. I heard that they want to completely shut down the downtown Seattle jail. I don't know if that's part of the county jail capacity or it's different from or in addition to. I'm not exactly sure. But the point is they're letting a lot of criminals out on the streets in the name of justice. Remember a couple weeks ago, abolish the police became a thing? All right, everyone's talking about abolish the police. It came out of nowhere, abolish the police. And everyone came out and said, that's crazy. And they said, we didn't really mean abolish the police. Look at you guys overreacting, blah, blah, blah. Here it is. I mean, how much closer to abolish the police do you want to get than 50% and then cut the funding and then 60% decrease jail capacity? That's as close to abolish as you could possibly get. Well, the city council the other day, I think unanimously, passed a resolution for police in Seattle to stop using tear gas against rioters. Now, you may be seeing this letter by now. This is a letter that the police chief, who's against that, sent to business owners. I'll just read let's jump to the second paragraph. Please also know that city council, crowd control tool goes into effect this weekend. This would have been last Sunday, 2 days ago. The ordinance bans Seattle police officers the use of less lethal tools, including pepper spray that's commonly used to disperse crowds that have turned violent. Simply put, the legislation gives officers no ability to safely intercede to preserve property in the midst of large violent crowd. For these reasons, Seattle police will have an adjusted deployment in response to any demonstration this weekend, as I will never ask our officers to risk their personal safety to protect property without the tools to do so in a safe way. That's the chief of police. So imagine you're a business owner and you get that from the chief of police. You're like, wait, what? So, like, that's just, you're on your own. That was like a nice way of saying you guys are all on your own now. Now, I guess one of the courts came in and said, city council, you can't do that. So it's going to work its way through the courts and all that. But the point is, you were always on your own. That's the truth. I mean, here's the chief of police saying you guys are on your own, but you were always on your own. And everyone deep down knows that. Right? This is why there were a record number of guns sold in the beginning of COVID, right? Because there was a hint of social unrest being a possibility. So people rushed out and got guns because they knew that when it hit the fan, they would be on their own. And then you throw on full-on riots on top of that. And like, I don't think you can fully imagine what it's like to be in the midst of a riot like that, truly fearing for your safety. And now knowing that no police are going to come help you, according to the chief of police, as ordered by the city council. Same thing, imagine being in your car, you're driving down the street and all of a sudden this big mob comes around you, they're blocking traffic and you're like, your kid's are in the car, your wife's in the car, and then if you drive away, no matter how slowly, someone's like, oh, they nicked my leg, oh, and then they sue you for, right? What do you do? Police, we're getting closer and closer to a point, potentially, if we keep it on this road, where police, it's not just going to be Seattle, where the chief of police is like, sorry, guys, nothing we can do for you. Except, by the way, except for them, right? Except for the city council. I guarantee you the city council in Seattle will still have police protection or they'll get private protection, right? I know you've been following at least a little bit that couple in St. Louis, right? That mob went to their property, peaceful protesters, went on their property, and the husband and wife came outside with their guns and they got charged with felonies. And the guy's like, listen, this is a totally upside down world where the prosecutor apparently thinks her job is not to keep us safe from criminals, but to keep the criminals safe from us. And I would say to Mr. McCluskey, yeah, it's all backwards. Everything's always backwards. And it's the same with criminal justice reform. Like when you hear criminal justice reform today, it's always letting people out of prison, right? And that's what Seattle's doing, right? They want to shut down prisons. Criminal justice reform means helping the prisoners. But it doesn't mean keeping law-abiding people safer from criminals, right? Like that should be criminal justice reform. More people in jail. Now, try this one out for size. This is an interesting point. I've never thought of this before. So one of the themes of the show is perhaps the opposite is true. Anytime you're told something, just think for a second, perhaps the opposite is true. The opposite's not always true, but it very often is. Why do we have jails? Think about this for a minute. Why do we have jails? Why do we have police? I would say, I think most people would say that we have a jail to keep the public safe from the criminal, right? We have a jail to separate the criminal from the public. So we're keeping the public safe from the criminal. Okay, so what's the opposite of that, right? You gotta think perhaps the opposite is true. So what's the opposite of we keep the public safe from the criminal? But the opposite would be we have police and jails to keep the criminal safe from the public? Could that be true? This is Glenn Reynolds. He's a law professor at UT Knoxville. And I say this because as police stop doing their job, and I don't blame the police officers or Seattle chief of police, I don't blame them at all. City council doesn't have their backs. So as police stop doing their job, what are we gonna see more of? We're gonna see more vigilante justice. And it was vigilante justice why we created police forces in the first place. So here's Glenn Reynolds. He said, remember, in the end, the police aren't there to protect the public from criminals. They're there to protect criminals from the public. Communities dealt with crime long before police were invented, usually in rather harsh and low due process ways. The bargain was, let the police handle it instead. No police, no bargain. So someone's robs your house. Before we had police, the neighbors would get together, we'd find you and kill you, or torture you, or beat you up, or do something not good with no due process whatsoever, with no jury of your peers, with no fair and impartial trial and judge. It was just might makes right. We found you, you did it, we think you did it anyway, we're gonna beat you up because of it. If you caught a child molester in your neighborhood, you'd kill him. So the police are there to protect the child molester, right? The police are there to say, hey, child molester guy, your neighbors here, they wanna kill you. Come with us and we'll put you in jail for 40 years. We will protect you from the vigilante justice from your neighbors who are going to kill you if we're not here for you. Right? Think about that. Now, listen, it's no picnic in jail and all that, but I'd argue it's much worse to live in a vigilante world. So here's what will happen. Without police, we'll either live with vigilante justice, people take a matter into their own hands, or we'll have cartels or gangs will rise up and fill that void, like in Mexico. In Mexico, the cartels run the show. There's no police in Mexico. This didn't get too much play last time. By the way, look at those guys. Who do you think that is? The Mexican military? It's a cartel. It's a cartel. It's a Mexican cartel. Look at those guys. This didn't get a lot of play, but El Chapo's son. So maybe it was like a year ago. The Mexican police accidentally bumped into El Chapo's son, and they arrested him. They're like, oh, geez, El Chapo's son. So they grabbed him, and the cartel like pressed a button and sounded some alarm and started killing police officers' families. Just boom, just like that. They're like code red, boom, killing officers' families. Full-on war breaks out everywhere in the town until the Mexican police just let them go. All right, so who's in charge there? The cartels are. No police. Without police, there's your police. You just saw them right there. That's what it looks like with no police in Mexico. All these people who want to abolish the police, what do you think is going to rise up instead? Oh, a polite, kind, volunteer force of social workers? What are you kidding me? Gangs and cartels are going to rise up. Well, I guess it'll be a couple of different things. If you're in a lower income neighborhood, the gangs are going to take over. If you're in a more middle class neighborhood, it'll be vigilante justice. And in upper class neighborhoods, it's going to be private police, private security. So you're going to see further inequalities. Right? The rich people are going to be protected by private police. The poor people are going to be protected by MS-13, which isn't protection at all. there's going to be an even bigger disparity than there is now. And the left are going to blame white people or white supremacy or Republicans or Trump, and then for something that, once again, was their fault. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to talk about churches opening in the midst of COVID. Grace to You, Grace Community Church. John MacArthur is the pastor. He's one of my favorite pastors in the country. If there was anyone in the church who I would want to be standing up to Gavin Newsom in the state of California, it would be John MacArthur. He's a man who only relies on Scripture for everything he says and does. I heard a good line from Christopher Bedford the other day, wrote an article in The Federalist. He said, if only our Christian leaders had the fiery devotion of the protesters. Anyway, the point is, John MacArthur wrote a blog post on Friday saying that they're going to open up their church for worship on Sunday, so 2 days ago. And they did, in fact, when many other churches aren't. So first of all, the hypocrisy with Black Lives Matter and the church, like, blaringly obvious. You can't go to a funeral. You can't visit a loved one in the hospital. You can't go to church, but 15,000 people can protest for Black trans lives matter in Brooklyn and protest all across the country, and that's no problem whatsoever. I think the moment when it all jumped the shark was in the beginning of COVID, and the nurses were like begging people to stay home. Remember all this stuff? And it was like pretty like, you're gonna kill grandma, my life is on the line, we're heroes, right? And all this stuff. Not all heroes wear capes. 2 weeks later, those same nurses are standing on the street outside their hospital applauding the protesters marching by for Black Lives Matter. It's like, what are you talking about, guys? The same people were just lecturing me the other day to stay inside, and now you got, like, the hypocrisy is totally out of control. If Grace Community Church, or if your church, if any church was a Black Lives Matter riot, which committed actual felonies in the streets, the authorities wouldn't even allow it. They'd celebrate it. But it's a church. It's got to be shut down. Can't be a church. But here's what's weird about it, too. The woke cult, that's a cult. It's a church. They got their own hymns. Listen, this was a protest out in Portland. Listen to this creepy hymn. Hands up, please don't shoot. 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 That wasn't creepy at all. Hands up, please don't shoot me. Hands up, please don't shoot me. Listen, I don't know any Christian hymns that sound like that. All right. Amazing grace, how sweet is the sound. Like, that is weird. That's truly like a weird culty thing. Like, that's like, that's what you do before like a human sacrifice. Hands up, please don't shoot. Not to mention, Michael Brown never even said that. But anyway, that's a different story. So you get thousands of people holding their phones up in the air and singing that hymn. But in California, you are literally banned from singing in church. You are not allowed to sing in church in California, but you can go ahead and do that. So you can sing Black Lives Matter songs, but you can't sing Christian songs. So, hey, Newsom, I don't know if you want to like send out a document telling me what songs I'm allowed to sing. What is the song, Newsom? What does my hymn have to be about, or my song have to be about for you to allow me to sing it? If I sing Amazing Grace, that's no good. If I sing Hands Up, Don't Shoot, that's fine. What do we need to know? Now, if you think I'm being silly, I'm not, right? This is the great Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, talking about what food bars need to serve in order to be allowed to stay open, right? So restaurants were allowed to open. Bars had to be closed unless you served food. So bars were like, okay, we'll just serve some food. And they were like, no, that's not enough food. Here's Cuomo.
To be a bar, you had to have food available. Soups, sandwiches, etc. More than just hors d'oeuvres, chicken wings. You had to have some substantive food. The lowest level of substantive food were sandwiches.
Okay, God. So if you're a bar that doesn't serve food, you got to shut down. But if you're a bar that sells chicken wings, you're like, I got food now, so it's okay. Nope, not good enough. That is not substantial enough to be considered food, apparently, according to the state of New York. I'd assume, I don't know, I'd assume that also includes jalapeno poppers, mozzarella sticks, bruschetta. Does bruschetta count enough for food? Or is that not enough food? Now, sandwiches count, right? So if you're a bar and you serve sandwiches, you're fine. So I don't know why you don't just take a couple chicken wings and slap them between two pieces of bread and call it a sandwich, right? But do you see the arbitrariness of this? This is what power-hungry people do when they're given power. They have arbitrary tyrannies like that, nitpicking over the smallest little thing. Anyway, back to the church. Sorry. This is Brian, I don't know if you pronounce his name, Suave maybe? He said, no amount, he's a pastor in Utah, no amount of accumulated social capital will avail the church to the surrounding culture. We know this. Even when Christians set up hospitals to serve the sick, they were reviled as hateful bigots. The church doesn't wage war via PR campaigns. When will we learn, right? He's talking about Samaritan's Purse. Remember the beginning of COVID, we talked to Samaritan's Purse a couple times. They set up field hospitals in Italy and New York City, maybe some other places. And there were protests against them. All right, so if you're a Christian, there's nothing you can do. Nothing you can possibly do in this world to receive worldly praise. So stop even searching for it. You'll never get it. It's not something you should even want anyway. So about meeting. If you don't think you should go to church because you're older or you have any other number of legitimate health reasons, oh goodness, no, please don't go. But for the state to ban you from going to church, I'm over it. So here's the very short of MacArthur's argument, and I encourage you to go to gty.org, GTY, Grace to You. So, and you can read his whole blog post and check out his sermon from last Sunday. But the very short of his argument is Christ, not Caesar, is the head of the church. So he says when state authorities issue orders that do not forbid your obedience to God's law, then their authority, the state's authority, is to be obeyed, whether you agree with the rulings or not. All right, so Romans 13, 1 Peter 2. Just this morning I read something out of Titus, which is very similar to this as well. You have to follow that. And it's Romans 13 is a very tricky, difficult, like lots of ramifications with Romans 13. You have to obey your civil authorities as powers that God has ordained. Very difficult for people to do. Now that's when it they don't force you to disobey your the Christian teaching. So that's like taxes, all right? So Newsom or whoever raises taxes to 50%. You don't like that. I don't like that. You have to do it according to the Bible. But here's MacArthur. While civil government is invested with divine authority to rule the state, neither of those texts, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, or any other, grants civic rulers jurisdiction over the church. MacArthur makes the point that there's three God-established institutions in human society. You have the family, the state, the church. Each institution has a sphere of authority with jurisdictional limits for them going out, like you can't go out of that jurisdictional limit, and to protect other entities from coming into it. So my authority as a father and my family is limited to my family. I can't go make dictates into your family. I can't go to my neighbors and start telling them, when their kids' bedtime is or whatever, right? This is my jurisdictional limit. I also can't control the state, and I'm not in charge of the church either. And it's true for every group. Newsom has his limit. The church and their church leaders are limited to their church jurisdiction. Government is specifically tasked, as MacArthur, specifically tasked with the oversight and protection of civic peace and well-being within the boundaries of a nation or community. God has not granted civic rulers authority over the doctrine, practice, or polity of the church. The biblical framework limits the authority of each institution to its specific jurisdiction. So it's sort of checks and balances. So in the end, MacArthur says, we as a church, we do not need the state's permission to serve and worship our Lord as he has commanded us. I'll say it again. As a church, we do not need the state's permission to serve and worship our Lord as he has commanded. Now again, I want to make the point here. Health-wise, if you're older, heart issues, diabetes, whatever, all the things, then maybe you shouldn't go. Or do go. It's up to you. It's not up to the state. It's not up to Kevin Newsom. Especially, he's lost all credibility, and all the governors everywhere have lost all their credibility when they let Black Lives Matter meet without any problem whatsoever. Note that MacArthur, he's not making a constitutional argument. You could make a constitutional argument. He's not. He's not making a legal argument, right? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then, of course, the First Amendment right to assemble. The church is, by definition, an assembly. The literal meaning of the word, like, it's Greek. The Greek word for church is ecclesia, which means the called out one, an assembly of the called out ones. Like, it literally means assembly. And ecclesia, church, literally means assembly, and you have the freedom to assemble. So that's the biblical argument. He was asked why he shut down in the first place then, right? The people are like, listen, you're telling Romans 13, all that applies now. Why did it not apply back in April or whatever? And he's like, oh, it did. We shut down back in April, not because the state told us to, but because we thought it was the right thing to do with all the unknowns with COVID. We did it ourselves. We made that decision. We didn't like, oh, Gavin Newsom, what do you think we should do on that? But now we know more, and we're going to take proper precautions, and it'll be fine. So we'll see what LA does. LA a couple weeks ago said that any business or church that violates their orders, the city's going to shut off their power and their water. We'll see. Again, there's no one I'd rather have leading that charge than John MacArthur. gty.org for more info there. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. I'm excited for our next guest, Richard Lyons, who wrote this book called The DNA of Democracy. So we're going to trace the history of democracy, ancient Greece, all the way to today, so that we can have this story, which we'll get to in a second here, the story and this timeline of this thing that is very precious and rare. So we'll do that coming up in just a minute. But first, I want to share this from Chloe Valdery, who's becoming one of my all-time favorite people. She wrote this piece about Nation of Islam. So Nation of Islam, without going into their whole thing, they are, for just shorthand, they're the black version of the Klan. Right? They're black supremacists, Nation of Islam. And she made the point that it's the group's founder, Elijah Muhammad, the founder of Nation of Islam. When he was a boy, he saw his father lynched right in front of it. Right here, he saw his father lynched when he was a young child. And she says, as human beings, we are biologically wired for story, and we need story, a compelling story, to survive. And Elijah Muhammad made up a story to explain the trauma that he experienced. And Chloe said that a story that places you at the center of the universe and depicts your enemies as inferior is very alluring. Now, here's the problem. First, it's easy to think that when a white person, or black, it doesn't matter, but from the Nation of Islam's perspective, when a white person does something evil, it's easy to conclude that they themselves are evil. See the difference? And that's not true. There's a sin versus sinner, right? Remember the Princeton University professor, I forget who he was, but he asks his students every year that if they lived in the South in the 1800s, do you think you would be slave owners or abolitionists? And gosh golly, wouldn't you know it, they'd all be abolitionists. Every single one of them would be passionate, tireless abolitionists if they lived in the South in the 1800s, they say. Yet they're all pro-abortion right now. So that's the first thing. Second, Nation of Islam and this whole mindset teaches that hatred is a virtue. I was listening to a YouTube video of Coleman Hughes, who I'm liking a lot as well. And he wrote this, I heard it just this morning. And someone else in the New York Times in 2017 wrote this piece. And it had here it is. I will teach my boys to have profound doubts that friendship with white people is possible. Whoa, wow. Is it even possible? I will teach them to be cautious. I will teach them suspicion. I will teach them distrust. I will have to discuss with my boys whether they can truly be friends with white people. That's a toxic person. That is a deceived person. And Coleman Hughes was reminded of the line from Thelonious Monk, like the jazz musician, who said, "They tried to get me to hate white people, but someone would always come along and spoil it." So you have people who believe, who have been taught that hatred is a virtue. But the truth is, as Chloe said, you cannot defeat an ideology if you do not understand what torments the ideologically dispossessed. And at the end of the day, it boils down to feeling purpose, feeling needed, and feeling loved. And if a society does not meet that basic need, it will be destroyed. And she says we need to understand the extent to which PTSD plays a major role in our bickering. Meaning we forget that we have way more in common. Way more in common. And I think the main problem with Black Lives Matter and all the rest of them is that we can't even talk to each other. So we'll never find out. We'll never see the things in common because we're supposed to hate each other because hatred is a virtue. So I love what she said earlier. She said we need better stories. And that's what we're going to do coming up with our next guest as well, right? We're going to hear the story of democracy and the story, therefore, of America. So we need better stories, right? Someone called me the other day on the radio show, and they said, Slater, listen, I'm totally with you on the Marxism and the oppressed versus oppressive narrative and all this stuff. But how do you combat that? How do you beat the narrative that you should be a victim? And I said, oh, well, we need better stories. You have to tell a better story than the victimhood story, because the victimhood story is a very compelling story, as we've been sharing a ton of Marx's life lately. And I think I ended one of the segments with something like, to bitter, entitled losers, the victimhood excuse is very compelling, or something like that, right? Which Marx was. Marx was a bitter, entitled loser. And if you are, then his philosophy makes a lot of sense to you. It's a good story. Again, the guy who was always in debt and had creditors always coming after him, and the guy who never paid his rent and was evicted time after time again, of course he's going to hate capitalism and landlords, right? And he made a story around that made sense to him, and it justified what he did. So we just need to share better stories. Let me share one here. Frederick Douglass, the great, was a slave, and he wrote a letter after he was free. He wrote a letter to his slave master. Short letter. It was an open letter. It was in a newspaper. And it highlights all some of the cruel things that the slave master did to him. Frederick Douglass talks about his family members that this man is still enslaving right at this time. So it's just horrific atrocities. And then he ends with this. Frederick Douglass does. I'll now bring this letter to a close. I intend to make use of you as a weapon with which to assail the system of slavery, as a means of concentrating public attention on the system and deepening their horror of trafficking in the souls and bodies of men. I shall make use of you as a means of exposing the character of the American church and clergy, and as a means of bringing the guilty nation with yourself to repentance. But in doing this, I entertain no malice towards you personally. There is no roof under which you would be more safe than mine. And there is nothing in my house which you might need for your comfort which I would not readily grant. Indeed, I would esteem it a privilege to set you an example as to how mankind ought to treat each other. There's your choice. You can either teach your son to not trust white people, or you can be like Frederick Douglass here and resolve yourself to set the example. Even the former slave made that resolution. And someone writing in the New York Times today can't? Give me a break. Again, the Thelonious Monk, they tried to get me to hate white people, but someone would always come along and spoil. Frederick Douglass, and same thing with Booker T. Washington, all these guys, the lack of bitterness right? I mean, this entire letter is a list of horrible, evil things that this man did to him and is still doing to his family. But still, Douglas was able to make a separation of the sin and the sinner that it's almost like incomprehensible if it weren't for Jesus, quite frankly, who Frederick Douglass was clearly a disciple of. And then the other part, Frederick Douglass talked about how bad it must be for you, slave master, to have done these things to your slaves. And Booker T. Washington talked a lot about this too. There was a pity that Booker T. and Frederick Douglass had to their slave masters. Like what's wrong with you and your heart and your soul? How sad that you're doing this to us. It wasn't an anger. I mean, there was time for that, certainly too, but it ultimately ended up with a pity. James Baldwin, the poet, he said, something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example, and another thing. What happens to the woman is ghastly, but what happened to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse. I'll end with this one. This is from, Douglas. He says, the responsibility which you have assumed in this regard is truly awful, being a slave master. And how you could stagger under it these many years is marvelous. Your mind must have become darkened, your heart hardened, your conscience seared and petrified. Or you would have long since thrown off the accursed load and sought relief at the hands of a sin-forgiving God. It's not hate, it's pity. And again, never could a hatred be more justified than with a man like Frederick Douglass. And even he didn't have it for long. He did for a while. And people walking around today have it. Heard this line yesterday. I just want to put it to you and see what you think. They said, if someone wounds you, that blood is on their hands. If you keep picking the scab, that blood's on yours. The DNA of democracy. Coming up next, true story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, glad you're here. I'm excited for our next guest. So, we've been spending a ton of time lately on philosophy and the philosophers that have got us to where we are now. Hegel, Marx, the Frankfurt School, Marcuse, Derrida, all these guys. And once you know this, now it makes a lot more sense. But like I said before, I want to kind of pivot away from what we're against and start talking more about what we're for and who we are so that we know not only what to attack, but what also to fight for and defend. And I think a great guy to help us with that is Richard C. Lyons. He's the author of this book, The DNA of Democracy. Richard, how are you, sir?
Very good, Mike. Good to be with you.
I'm glad you're here. Let's sit in this for a little bit here. Let's go slow for me, because this is super important and things that I never learned in school, unfortunately. Let's go back. Well, let's start here. Why is democracy important? Let's define that first. What is it? Why does it matter? And then I want to go back to the beginning of it, and hopefully we can do a little tracing of its lineage to today. So what is it? Why does it matter?
Well, that's exactly what the DNA of democracy does. It traces exactly what you're talking about. And it actually goes back to the 10 Commandments, which were the foundation of law, as above kings or tyrants. And so you trace from there the lineage of democracy to Greece and Athens, where a constitutional government was founded based on the individual and based on the power of the individual. And through their legislature, they created law for all individuals who were citizens at the time. Then it turns to Rome and the representative government that they had, the Republic. From there, the DNA of democracy moves to England with the Magna Carta, and then with the all-important English Civil War, which turned absolute divine right into the absolute power of the individual through their assembly. So, and then we turn to America, which has a little piece of all those elements of Greece and Rome and England, added to the fierce independence of the Iroquois League, which actually had their own assemblies and their own federal form of government. So each of those are represented in the book. So this is the foundation of our reality in America. The book then goes on to the price paid in the Civil War for the compromise of democracy in the Constitution when we deemed the African race to be 3/5 of a person and not a whole person, in contravention of the Declaration of Independence. So to write that, we went through a horrible war, unprecedented in history, and still unprecedented to this day in any other place in the world.
Okay, I got a lot of questions. Let's go back. Why do you think, this is a huge question, but why do you think Athens was the birthplace? Why ancient Athens and nowhere else? What happened there that was the spark?
I think the people were more defiant, and they had a tyrant there called Isagoras. And Isagoras was a greedy person, and so he, of a sudden, decided that half the population of Greece should be dispossessed of their property because they were cursed. He claimed them to be cursed. He took their property, he exiled them, and said he was now the owner of their property and goods. And they took it for a while and then said, well, wait a minute, this is wrong. We're not cursed, we've done nothing wrong, and yet we're dispossessed. And so Isagoras hired a Spartan army to defend his tyranny. And the Spartans, of course, were an undefeated army at that time. They had all the legendary strength that they were renowned for. And they occupied the Acropolis, the height of a plateau in central Athens. The people decided to climb that plateau against, storming spears and arrows and retake their government from Isagoras and the Spartan army. So that was the first real rebellion that ended in a democracy being created.
I've never heard anything like that. Why does a big part of me is like, oh, you're just making this up.
No,
like you're just totally making that up.
No, it took a lot of work to find that out. So
Wow,
diligent research.
That's amazing. Okay.
And then the same thing occurred in Rome with the Tarquins. They were a family who came into possession of a lot of property and felt that they owned the kingship. Now, the kingship was supposed to revolve between persons, and it was an elective office. Then the Tarquins found someone in office in Silvius Tullius who they did not care for, and they thought the kingship was their own by right. So they overtook the government, and it took another rebellion against the Tarquins to bring the Republic to Rome.
So I'm sensing a theme here that democracy is the offspring of tyranny. Revolution's a big word, but yeah, so it's tyranny first and then people rebelling against that. Is that always the case or tends to be the case?
It's a crucible of tyranny that produces a rebellion, that produces a group of people who believe they are all individually of equal rights in government. So that has been the theme, and it recurred again in America.
Yeah. Why? So would you say what would be the natural state of man? Like, what's the natural state of government then? Because democracy, I would say, would be the outlier in history.
It is. It is.
Okay, so what's the natural state?
Well, let's discuss what's directly in the book. And that is the way that America was uniquely formed was because the English set up these colonies based on English law. They gave different charters to different persons to create governments in America, and those governments were based on assembly, but nothing else. So you had the town. The town was the original government in America. What happened in the absence of a overlord tutelary government was that the natural society set itself up. The family was more important. Faith was more important. The teachers in America were more important. The townspeople were more important. Their businesses were more important in the absence of government. So it's what I call the natural springs of society. Oddly, Woodrow Wilson called it the same thing, even though he didn't much believe in it. But they are the natural springs of authority, and I call it the American arch of the individual, of family, of faith, of property, occupation, and enterprise. And they were the original powers in America. What happened was that after the 7 Years' War, the English government was broke because they expanded their empire and went to the American colonies to pay for it. So they rigorously set up a ministerial government that was very tyrannical to the people who had lived for 100 years without any government other than their own, their town. So the revolution was in answer to that. There was 15 years where this ministerial government took over and they said, wait a minute, where are we living? This isn't America anymore.
What year was that?
Well, the French and Indian War in America, right, was 1756 to 1763. And then the ministerial law began to take effect, where the colonies were made to pay through Stamp Act and so forth, the tea tax, to pay for the war that had happened. And they set up a whole series of offices of tax collectors, which they behave like an elite gradation of society, an elite grade of society above everybody else. It was very corrupt. And the colonists said, who are you? What do you do? And they were all British people coming into America. And then the British sent their army over to make sure that the taxes were collected, and we became an occupied place in contravention to what the colonists thought was their law.
Yes. Oh, very good. Okay, so to go back to the question then, and this is a big one, but I want to be able to visualize this. So then I would have argued the natural state of man is to live under tyranny. But it sounds like your argument is like America in its original colonial form was maybe a natural state, and then the tyranny came in. How would you describe that?
I would say you're exactly correct. And what I call tyranny is the common keep of humanity, and that's right at the beginning of the book. And it's been the way of government, human government, since the pharaohs. I mean, and you can extrapolate that to anything you want. The rarity of America was that because it was founded in a wilderness and under the common law, British common law, something wonderful happened. All the original powers of humanity, being individual, family, faith, etc., were able to emerge and create a society that was not tyrannically governed until the British sought to exert themselves after the 7 Years' War.
Wow, that's so good. Okay,
it's very uniquely founded.
Yeah, I love this. Okay, a last question for you, and I want people to buy the book, The DNA of Democracy, Richard C. Lyons. It's on Amazon. It's a couple bucks. So as you were describing the timeline and the lineage, if you will, to use the DNA analogy, I was listening because we're very woke now, Richard. So I was like, oh, this is very Eurocentric. Right? This is everything you're describing is very Eurocentric. I wonder if there's any other strains of this DNA in the world.
I don't want to give that impression. A very large part of the beginning of America was living among the Iroquois League.
Bingo. And that's when you brought that in, and that's a beautiful thing. Talk more about that for a few minutes.
Well, it was new to the Europeans coming over to America. The Iroquois had their own assemblies, their own congresses. And their whole philosophy was that the common federal government among the League had to be kept at a minimum for individual liberty to be at a maximum. And they believed in maximum liberty for the individual. Their entire government was based on advice and counsel, not dictation. So there were no rulers, there were sachems. Sachems were sachems because they won their positions by merit, not necessarily martial merit, but those who benefited the tribe the most in their lifetime, who gave of themselves rather than taking to themselves from society. So that was that was a wonderful thing for the colonists to find. So at the same time that you have philosophers like John Locke preaching individual liberty and natural rights, the colonists were discovering a people who believed in that and didn't have an overlord of any kind. And they were witness to their assemblies and congresses. And when they were working out treaties, they discovered, well, these people actually discuss among the whole tribe the rightness or wrongness of a treaty and accept it based on the merits, on the reason and rational nature of it. So it was quite an illumination, and at the same time this was going on, they were learning about the Greeks and Romans and how they had assemblies and how they worked together to come to resolution.
That's so good. All right, I want everyone to buy the book, The DNA of Democracy, Richard C. Lyons. And again, I say this with every time we have an expert come on like you. They're so smart. I just get so annoyed that I never learned this stuff. And I grew up in Syracuse, New York, which was Iroquois nation, Iroquois
yes.
Indian land. Like we grew up learning about the Iroquois, but I never learned about this. So it's out there. The DNA of Democracy, Richard C. Lyons. Richard, a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
No, thank you, Mike, very much for your time.
Great stuff.
Thank
Good
you.
story, Mike Slater. Spread the word.